Hello everyone, we're going to be back in book number 1, aka the Sipapu Oddessy in the Phoenix Journals, and this is the protest. It was a Cinerama morning, not unlike millions of other days that had begun with spreading rose and golden rays across the same spot on that very desert floor for eons past. It was a morning best described as a watercolor or colored crayon morning, with variegated rainbow hues of light in the east. A few drops of early moisture on a lone cactus flower at Bob's feet, waiting to vanish as the sun would spread more warmth across the landscape, caught his thoughts for a moment as he stepped from his convertible. He knew he would need to raise the top against the heat within an hour. It was early August and summer heat still claimed the Nevada desert. Everything is the same. Nothing is the same, flitted through his mind as he surveyed the panorama which spread in endless distance before him. For a brief moment even the wind had ceased its endless screaming, and the earth was stilled as if waiting for the next act to begin. As he looked around, he honestly wondered if there would be a turn of the century. Everything had changed. Weather patterns resembled nothing in recorded history. Earthquakes occurred where historically there had been none. Torrential rains flooded rivers and streams where rain had previously been rare. Temperatures ranged many degrees higher in summer, and winters grew increasingly colder and more severe, as discernible seasons, spring and fall, had disappeared. Drought destroyed areas previously excellent for natural agriculture, while deserts experienced rain in torrential downpours. Volcanoes erupted, which had been dormant for thousands of years. He had a premonition of some demented giant beast of prey. He interrupted his thoughts as he turned and strolled over toward a small group of people gathered at the main gate to the Nevada Yucca Flats testing grounds. He expected to find hundreds of people there attending a massive anti-nuclear demonstration. Instead, there were only a few standing around in detached small groups involved in private discussions. The event was to have begun 2 days earlier, so it was apparent something had happened to change the plan. He would have to ask some questions, but he was pretty sure he already knew what had occurred. Bob had made arrangements with his closest friends Steve and Diana Hensley to join them for the demonstration rally there at the main gate, but they were nowhere in sight. Bob lived in Los Angeles, awaiting sale of his house. Following the sale, he would be moving to the Tehachapi Mountains in the Mojave Desert area of California, where he would join Steve and Diana, who had made the move a couple years before. The current plans were for Bob to drive to the rally after tying up some business loose ends and meet the Hensleys at the demonstration. Following years of struggle and fighting, the government was continuing with plans to bury nuclear waste from the U.S. nuclear power plants at Yucca Mountain. The mountain was within the Yucca Flats test area, so the federal government had total lethal control. That particular waste material was the most radioactive substance on Earth. Even though several small earthquakes had rumbled through the Yucca Flats area in the past 2 years, the feds had taken no apparent notice. Nuclear waste disposal had become by far the major problem facing not only the United States but the entire world. Bob knew he shouldn't expect the government to act otherwise. The problem was of such mammoth proportions that there was no workable solution other than closing down nuclear power production. The problem of disposal of the already existing waste would remain a major issue even if the nukes were shut down. Besides nuclear, even hydrogen devices continued to be detonated underground at Yucca Flats. The feds made every effort to keep the information from the public, but information leaks always occurred. The public was getting fed up. At the rate men was setting up his own destruction in the United States, concern about some foreign country precipitating disaster was unnecessary, Bob thought ironically to himself. What really struck terror into his heart, however, was what other countries might be doing with their nuclear waste. In 1986, it was known that the United States ranked 10th down the list for use of uranium in nuclear power plants for production of electricity. France had ranked first. At that time, it would have required a truckload of waste material every 90 minutes, 24 hours every day for 20 years to deliver the nuke waste for the U.S. to 12 any one storage site. In the intervening time, the problem could only grow worse. What might the Europeans, Russians, and Asians be using for storage of their nuclear wastes? That reservoir of death was guaranteed to be lethal for hundreds of thousands of years to come. Man was creating deadly time bombs which could be triggered for untold future generations, should we be fortunate enough to have future generations. Bob returned his attention to the absent demonstrators. He was confident he knew where he would find them. The big boys had started to play rougher and rougher as the public became more and more vocal in their resistance to damage to humanity and Mother Earth. People had begun to fight back, and local police and local government agencies only half-heartedly cooperated with the feds. No one in his right mind would want that deadly stuff in his playpen. Surely no thinking person would want to live next door to one of those lethal disposal sites. Especially frightening was the detonation of the hydrogen explosions mere feet from the buried wastes. Bob and his friends always brought traveler's checks for $2,000 to $3,000 to all protest gatherings for use of bail money should it be needed. However, it had been a long time since any funds had been required. Facts were that that law personnel and local residents greatly appreciated and profusely thanked the demonstrators. They extended every possible courtesy. Protesters were arrested and or dispersed only because of the direct federal orders to do so. Arrest had become only a technical formality. In addition to political big boys, there were also ones jokingly referred to as Mebbies. Mebbies was a short tag for men in black, who were representative of dark forces, aka mafia or big business hoods, who attempted to stop any progress toward what could be classified as goodness and light. Somehow they sensed that the love thy neighbor idea would put them back out of business. As Bob looked over the cars parked at the entrance, he noted one of the big black limousines, typical of the Mebbies, parked there. Why would they be here? Flitted through his mind. As he turned back towards the people at the gate, he smiled a bit as he looked up into the gorgeous blue sky with only a few puffy clouds, and made a mental note of the ever-circling red tail drifting majestically overhead. At times he wondered to himself if there were only two on Earth. It seemed everywhere he found himself there would be one, and sometimes two red-tailed hawks doing their graceful gliding ballet of freedom. He thought perhaps it might be the same ones. He knew better, but it suited his fancy to claim one for his own. He liked to think of it as his guardian angel, who could see all and know all, an entity untouched and undaunted by man's stupidity. If I have my choice, I'm coming back as a red tail, he thought, if there is a next time, and if there is a place to come back to. As he approached the group, one of the men acknowledged his presence, and after exchanging a few pleasantries, he inquired about the happenings and whereabouts of the demonstration participants. As expected, the protest leaders had been arrested and taken to Las Vegas. The remainder of the crowd had been forcibly dispersed. The protest rally had, however, been successful. Many very well-known public figures had attended and efforts had been effective. A restraining order had been handed down by the court to cease all test activities until further studies could be undertaken and evaluated. Bob chose not to identify himself because the group remaining at the site was certainly not on his side of the issue. He and the Hensleys were among those having acquired dubious titles of troublemakers, and the group within which he found himself was one against which he troubled. He was unwilling to risk hostilities, so pleasantly took leave of the group. As he headed his car toward Las Vegas, he pondered over his past 24 hours. It seemed as if years instead of hours separated him from last evening. He had gotten too sleepy to drive safely, so had parked off a side road, pulled out his sleeping bag, and stretched out on the ground. He could mentally recall the fresh scent of the night-cooled, moist earth. He had stared at the universe above and felt overwhelmed by the heavens. He loved to spend time in that manner and often went alone to the desert or mountains in order to spend a night under the stars. The experience always renewed his balance and refueled his energies. He had a strange attachment to those bits of light, as if he belonged out there among them. He had experienced such feelings and longings since he could recall memories. It was on one such night that the realization came that he would do whatever would be required in an effort to bring a halt to the incredible insanity going on about him. He knew he could no longer leave the task to someone else, but rather must take an active contribution to peace and safety on earth. He had known from that moment he must pursue the goal regardless of physical consequences to himself. He silently thanked God that he was not alone. It was about an hour's drive into Las Vegas, and he knew where to go. This was his 10th trip to the local jail for the same purpose, although he had usually been among the detained. He was filled with amusement as he entered the police station parking lot and stopped the car. The parking lot resembled a giant pep rally. The air was vibrant with victory, and spirits were high. Local residents had brought large urns of coffee and boxes of rolls of donuts. His friends all talked at once, in an effort to describe the happenings and express sorrow that he had missed the excitement. It was truly a fabulous day. The demonstration brought much more rapid results than anticipated, and that meant there would be some remaining time free for other activities. The participants had arranged to stay at the site for a minimum of 3 weeks should it become necessary. It was only Wednesday of the first week, so there would be over 2 weeks to vacation. Bob felt elated as he searched the sky for his guardian redtail and smiled to himself when he located it soaring in tandem with its mate in ever-enlarging circles above. "Why," he asked out loud to the sky, "are you here? The jackrabbits are scarce in downtown Vegas. But thank you. Your dedication to Mother Earth keeps us reminded of our assignment to care for her." The accident. Bob, Diana, and Steve discussed the possibilities of some extended time for travel, and a decision was reached to take the next couple of weeks and explore the canyonlands of southern Utah. Steve had spent much of his youth at the Robber's Roost Ranch, which at one time covered most of the area used by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as hideout for the Wild Bunch. The ranch was located in a very remote and inaccessible area dotted with hundreds of ancient, excuse me if I mispronounce this, Anasazi campsites and ruins. Bob had formed a close and lasting friendship with Steve while both attended college at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Bob had been to the Roost with Steve several times, and it was exciting to think of returning for a few days. Diana had never been in that particular part of Utah, so it was with much excitement that the three made plans for the trip. They decided they would leisurely drive along the route and stop for sightseeing as they wished. They made plans to rent a plane in Green River for an overlook of the ranch and canyonlands. They would then take enough extra time for a pack trip into the canyons. There were many ancient and beautiful Indian paintings in the canyons adjacent to the ranch, as well as many old Indian ruins and caves to be explored. Their immediate decision was to leave Las Vegas, drive for a couple of hours, and spend the night in Mesquite, Nevada. They would also finalize their trip plans and make necessary phone calls. Steve was driving as they left Mesquite the next morning, and Diana was in the front seat beside him. They had hooked up the seat belts, and Diana had snuggled happily as close to Steve as was possible considering the bucket seats and seat belts. Bob scooched over on his back across the back seat in order to soak in the beautiful sky and perhaps nap a bit in the warm sun. To anyone who might be following, it would appear as if two young lovers were off on a holiday. As they entered an area called Virgin River Canyon, traffic was light, the scenery was magnificent, and moods were exuberant. An agreement had been reached among the three to discard thoughts and conversations of anything other than happy topics. They would simply leave all the nuclear negatives behind for a brief few days allotted for the vacation, so they tittered happily about the adventures awaiting them. Bob was napping when Steve became aware of a limousine rapidly approaching them from behind. Then, as the car slowed alongside, it became obvious that the intention was to force him from the highway. Steve made every conceivable maneuver in an effort to evade contact with the assailant, and the minutes that followed were terrifying. Ultimately, Steve could no longer maintain control of the convertible as he was being struck continually from his left by the much heavier car. Diana's door had flung open, and only her seatbelt held her inside the auto. Bob was being thrown about so violently that he finally was unable to get up from the floor where he had landed following the second impact. The assault had continued for nearly a mile, and they were deep into the canyon where the river was far below the highway in the bottom of the gorge. As the car left the road, it ripped through a guardrail, flew over the embankment, and crashed downward through brush and over rocks and boulders. The car finally came to rest more than half submerged upside in the river. Bob was thrown clear of the vehicle, his body lodged behind a shrub and a very large boulder. Resisting death. The limousine stopped, and three men peered over the wreckage. They then hurried back into the still-running auto and sped away when they noted an oncoming vehicle. The approaching car had been following farther behind the Hensleys and screeched to a halt at the break in the guardrail. The occupants had witnessed the accident from a distance. However, they were unaware there were more than two persons in the convertible. There was a red-tailed hawk making tight circles above the scene, observing everything below. He screeched his piercing cry twice and continued his silent soaring. Bob was only semi-conscious, and his body was positioned in such a way that he could only glimpse the foremost part of the car edged into the river. He could only watch helplessly as his beloved friends were overflooded by the water. He was vaguely aware that people had stopped to help, but was in such pain and helplessness he was unable to attract attention to himself. He sensed Steve and Diana were dead, and had the perception that he too was dying. He could see that his left arm dangled halfway to the wrist, and both arm bones protruded at an acute angle. Both his legs felt useless. Blood was pouring over his eyes from a cut on his forehead, and his head hurt unbearably. Pain radiated from every pore of his body, and he wondered how long it took to die. The hawk continued to circle above the scene in its timeless way, forever observing. Bob had a remote feeling he was somehow with the hawk, or perhaps the hawk itself, looking down at the picture with total detachment. In the consuming pain, he could only wish death would come quickly. It almost amused him to realize that he was thinking of death with cold irony. He and the Hensleys had accomplished so much in their recent efforts to better the environment and to do something toward healing Mother Earth, and here it seemed to bluntly end in a riverbed in an Arizona canyon. He wondered if this, after all, would be all there was to life. He was sure he would very shortly learn what, if anything, comes next after death, and managed a half smile. During the following period of time he was unconscious, and when he aroused himself he could not tell how long his mind had been thankfully asleep. When consciousness would occur, he was immediately swept away on another wave of pain. His awareness and desire to survive began, however, to take control during the periods of consciousness. He knew that in order to survive, he must take some kind of action. With his one usable arm, he was able to drag his body in slow, agonizing inches up the embankment. He moved toward a pitifully shallow spot of shade under a sparse bush. The unconscious periods seemed longer each time, but he knew he must retain enough awareness and strength to enable reach of the tiny spot of shade. He knew if he could not, he would literally cook in the intense sunlight. In a final, valiant effort, he lunged forward, grabbed the root of growth of the bush, and pushed and pulled himself forward. In the effort, he lost his balance, rolled agonizingly over the broken arm, and onto a sandy washout at the foot of the bush. Blessed dark silence washed over his consciousness. As the darkness swept over him, he was vaguely aware of the hawk. "Some guardian angel you are," he mused. He was not aware of the activity at the accident site, and would have been only remotely interested anyway. Even in his lucid moments, he felt removed from everything around him. As consciousness next crept into his reality, it had been a longer interval of time in the unknown. He was again in full sunlight, and the sun was much lower in the sky. He couldn't tell if he was dreaming or experiencing. The pain was his only connection with life. He tried to attach himself to reality, and he looked around as far as he could see without moving his broken body. He found that he had been able to pull himself into the mouth of what appeared to be a very deep canyon running perpendicular to the river gorge. To his right eye caught sight of the hawk, which had quit the air and was resting on a high rock ledge above him. He noted to himself that he was glad it was not a vulture, or for sure he was in trouble. Looking in the other direction, he focused, with extreme difficulty, on a shallow sandstone cave in the vertical wall of the side canyon. Blinking and staring, he could make out a life-size Indian painting. It was a picture of an Indian maiden with birds circling her head and shoulders. He felt he must be dead or dreaming, surely having hallucinations. The painting triggered a flood of memories, causing him to realize that as long as he could use his brain and conjure memories, he could maintain some attachment to reality. It also enabled him to evacuate the circumstances in which he had now found himself. He now became immersed in a scene in his memory of a day long ago when he had visited the roost area. He had been hiking up a long-forgotten canyon and happened upon an identical painting. He wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, but it seemed of no consequence, and only of mild interest. As he roused following the memory experience of the painting, he realized that if he could keep his mind active with memories, he could sustain lucidity for longer periods of time. Therefore, he thrust his effort into recalling everything, even the most tiny details that entered into his consciousness. And that'll be the end of this one.